Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 4. Today, we're going to be talking about trade and inequality. So this is going to be a little bit of a break from trade theory and looking at different models that can explain the causes of trade. And we're going to think more about data, recent trends, and how we can apply these models to the real world. So just as a refresher, in the last lecture, we looked at the Heckscher-Ohlin model, which gave us a framework for thinking about the effects of trade on the distribution of income. So one of the main results there was the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. This says that an increase in the relative price of a good leads to an increase in the price of the factor it is intensive in. So for example, if the price of a labor-intensive good increases, that's going to be good for workers. Wages are going to increase. But this would be bad for capital owners because it means that the rental rate of capital or the income of capital owners is going to decline. So in other words, this means that relatively scarce factors are actually going to lose from trade, while relatively abundant factors will gain from trade. And this is because when we open up to trade, the price of goods that are intensive in the relatively abundant factor will increase. So this is going to have some implications for understanding recent trends in US inequality and the consequences of trade. And we're also going to think about the implications of this for global inequality. After that, we're also going to take a look at a few other ways that trade can affect the distribution of income outside of this standard Heckscher-Ohlin or factor intensity story. So first of all, one important trend globally and in the US is just that trade in the past few decades has been increasing. So since the post-war period around the world, we've had this really rapid increase in the share of exports to global GDP. For the United States, this is a little bit less true, but it's still the case that trade has been increasing, especially since around 1980. This is driven by changes in technology. So for example, shipping containers and just overall transportation technology have improved, and this lowers the costs of international trade. But there are also changes in institutions and policy. So tariffs have been going down. We have institutions like the World Trade Organization. We have regional trade agreements like NAFTA or the European Union. And all of this means that the real costs of trade, the physical costs of moving goods or services across the world, as well as, the various policies that could inhibit trade have been declining. And so trade is playing a larger role in the global economy and the United States economy than it used to. So another trend that's been going on over the same time is a rise in domestic income inequality. So on this chart, we can see the share of total income that's going to different groups of workers. People, actually, this is just overall earners, so it's multiple sources of earnings. So we have the top 1%, the top 10%, and the lower 50%. So we can see that since 1980, the share of earnings going to the top 10% of earners has been increasing. The share of earnings going to the top 1% has been increasing. And the share of earnings that's been going to the lower 50% has actually been decreasing. And we should note that this is pre-tax income. So government taxes are progressive. And this means that the top 1% and the top 10% pay higher taxes. And government spending is also going to reduce this somewhat. There's various government transfer payments that are going to go more to the lower 50% than to other groups. But it does mean that the economic fundamentals have been changing in a way such that the top is increasingly earning more, the bottom is increasingly earning a lower share. And so how should we interpret this rise in inequality through the Heckscher-Ohlin model? So remember that the Heckscher-Ohlin model says relative abundance, and this in turn is going to tell us who gains from trade and who loses from trade. So for example, If we export capital intensive goods and import labor intensive goods, that tells us that the United States is relatively capital abundant. This means we should expect capital to benefit from increased trade and labor to lose from increased trade. So this would offer, a pretty clean story for thinking about this trend. The top 1% or the top 10% might be more likely to be capital owners, and they would be benefiting from trade. The bottom 50% more likely to just have labor income, so they would be losing out from trade. But it's actually a little bit more complicated. So for the United States, one of the big stories in trade has been increased trade of China, and especially increased imports of manufactured goods from China, as well as decreased employment in the manufacturing sector. So over here, we've got total imports from China as a percentage of US GDP. You can see that it's been increasing, and especially after 2000, we have this very stark increase in imports from China. And then over this whole period, back to the 90s and a little bit before even, we have decreased employment in manufacturing. So this capital intensive story is actually not so clean, right? Because this tells us that the United States is actually importing manufactured goods, right? And so if manufacturing is capital intensive, that says that the United States is actually a capital scarce country. And we should expect capital to be losing from trade. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. But is it really the case that importing manufactured goods means that the U.S. is labor abundant, or that trade is hurting U.S. capital and benefiting labor? So let's take a broader picture of what the United States is really exporting and importing to get a better idea of the factor content. So over here, what I've done is I've taken the top sources of U.S. exports and the top sources of U.S. imports from 2018. And you can see that for the export sector, we've got travel and transportation. That's our top source. This is kind of more of a service. We've got food and other agricultural products. We've got fuels. But now we actually start to getting in some other manufactured goods. So auto parts, industrial machines, passenger cars, pharmaceuticals, and some other services. So finance and insurance, intellectual property. So if you try to summarize, what we have these high exports in, I think a good summary is that these are industries that are skill intensive or capital intensive. So, many of these service industries, such as finance and insurance, these are very skill or knowledge intensive service sectors. For our manufactured goods, we're focusing more on finished manufacturers. So industrial machines, passenger cars, pharmaceuticals is a little bit of a service. There's a lot of knowledge and skills and research that goes into that, but it is also a manufacturing sector, and we're exporting manufactured pharmaceuticals. A good example of this skill-intensive export is, on the back of every iPhone, it says designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. So, iPhones have sort of a distributed global supply chain. The thing that the United States is specializing in is the design. This is the knowledge intensive part of this. It's the intellectual property part of it. And the actual manufacturing, putting it together, that's been outsourced to China. And it's, maybe some capital there, maybe some labor. I don't really know which would be intensive in, but it's like they're taking the blueprints from the United States and doing the actual, routine assembly part somewhere else. Another good example of knowledge-intensive exports in the U.S. is the higher education sector. So the United States has a lot of world-class, very renowned universities, such as the University of Maryland. And this is actually a pretty successful export sector in the United States because of all the international students that come to the United States to learn. So there's a lot of knowledge in our universities, and we export that to the rest of the world by having students from other places come to benefit from that knowledge. And even though agriculture, that's pretty land intensive, obviously, but that's like one of the United States' largest export sectors. But it's actually increasingly mechanized and capital intensive, and this is especially true in the export sector. So for things like soybeans or corn or wheat, like the big things that we export to the rest of the world, these are very, very capital intensive and increasingly knowledge intensive. There's a knowing how to work these, automated irrigation or tractor systems, things like that. There's apparently some good YouTube channels of like what farmers do. There's a lot of like screens and machines and things like that. So overall, I think a good summary of this is that the factor content of trade, it's pretty diverse in the US, but it's overall biased towards things that are skill intensive or capital intensive. And so those are the factors, skills and knowledge and capital that we should be expecting to benefit from trade. So looking back at this picture, it seems that trade still could have a role to play. Capital could be benefiting from trade. High skilled or highly educated workers could be benefiting trade. Well, more blue collar or lower educated workers could be losing out from trade. But another big takeaway of the past few slides is that for the Heckscher-Ohlin story to work here, we need to have a few additional details. I think the important one is that we need to have many factors. So it's not just labor and capital. We have to differentiate between different types of labor. And this could be like high skilled versus low skilled, or high educated versus low educated, knowledge versus more manual or routine. But we have that differentiation to make. And we should also think about the role of other trends. So a big debate right now is the role of trade versus what's called skill bias technological change. And we're going to talk about that next. And the other thing is, in the Heckscher-Ohlin story, we're thinking about the long run equilibrium of trade and how it affects factor payments. But we should also be concerned about the effects of outsourcing or worker displacement. So we're also going to talk about that. So another trend in the US economy, again, since about 1980, is that there's been a growing education premium. So in other words, the gap between college and non-college workers is growing. So these charts are showing for men and women, the total earnings growth for workers with different levels of education. So we've got high school dropouts, high school graduates, workers with some college degrees and graduate degrees. And we can see that for both men and women, earnings for workers with a college degree or graduate degree have been increasing pretty substantially. So these blue lines have both gone up since 1980. However, for workers with some college or just a high school degree, wages have been more stagnant. So for men since 1981, there's been basically no change in earnings for workers with some college. And this is real earnings. So earnings have gone up in nominal sense, but it's basically the same rate as inflation. And for high school graduates, it's actually been a little bit of a decrease. For women, you see these more modest increases, but it's, again, not as much as workers with college degrees. And things are even more dire for high school dropouts. So altogether, this means that there's a gap that's growing between college and non-college workers, or even a gap between graduate and bachelor's degree holders. And so this suggests that the return to knowledge or skills or education has been growing in the United States. So we've just seen that based on the factor content of trade, that increased trade could be responsible for this. Growing trade, it's rewarding our export sectors, which are knowledge intensive. But there's this ongoing debate about the effects of trade versus what's called skill bias technological change, which would be a competing explanation for the growing return to skills or knowledge or education. So skill-biased technological change is the idea that there's been technological growth that's augmenting the productivity of high-skilled workers more than it is the productivity of low-skilled workers. So, globalization has been increasing. We know that, but if you just think about how the world today is different than the world of 1980, there's also this massive technological change. We've got the internet that didn't exist in 1980. We've got things like spreadsheets and faster computers and all sorts of things like payroll or accounting software, or the App Store that could increase the returns to having certain types of skills, no matter what's happening with trade. And so it's a big and important question. Like, what's causing this divergence between high-skilled and low-skilled workers? Is it trade or is it technology? And so the thing is that trade and technology both could have this prediction of increased inequality between high education and low education workers. But we'd like to be able to differentiate between them. And so what we want to do is come up with some other predictions of trade versus technology change that are different. And we would call this a testable hypothesis. So, something that we could observe in the data that's going to come out of one of these possible causes, but not the other. And they have a nice case in the textbook that we're going to go over now of a testable hypothesis for distinguishing between trade and skill-biased technological change. And so that, this figure is straight from the textbook. But the idea is that with skill-biased technological change, that should affect all sectors equally, right? Like technology, computers, internet, whatever, that's happening across the economy broadly. And so what we should see is if there has been skill-biased technological change, every sector, no matter how skill-intensive it was to start, should increase in its skill intensity, right? We should see more high-skilled employment within each sector. And now increased trade doesn't have this prediction. What's happening with increased trade is that we reallocate employment across sectors, but the employment mix within sectors doesn't really change. And so we can use that diverging prediction to see whether or not trade or skill-biased technological change is playing a larger role. So there's one test of this that they go through in the textbook, and it is supportive of the skill-biased technological change hypothesis. So what they do is they group sectors by their skill intensity. So you have sectors over here that are not very skill intensive, a little bit more than the most skill intensive sectors over here. And then they're plotting the share of production versus non-production employment. So non-production means management or the type of like business support functions. And so this is a measure of skilled versus unskilled employment that is used a lot just because it's very accessible, because firms on various tax forms or something have to report production employees versus non-production employees. So it's just very easy to use. But it is an imperfect measure. But anyway, so what we see is that across all of these sectors of differing skill intensity, there's an increased ratio of non-production employees to production employees. So basically it means there's more managers per worker. And this is across the economy. So even in the least skill intensive sectors, we see this. And so this does suggest that technological change has had these broad changes on the US economy. And this has led to just this widespread increase in the demand for high skilled workers. So this growing education premium, the gap between high education and low education workers, skill-biased technological change has definitely been contributing to this. That's what this test says. but it doesn't really rule out the effects of trade, right? We could still see a reallocation between different sectors, but this within sector increase in the skilled employment ratio means that we have had some skill bias technological change. So whatever's going on with trade, it's not just trade. And so the next thing we want to think about is the role of outsourcing and displacement. So we're sort of departing from the Heckscher-Ohlin model here. And we're thinking about other real world consequences that the model doesn't capture. So again, this doesn't totally, this test doesn't really totally exonerate trade from responsibility for changes in US inequality. For the one part, because this doesn't really rule out trade, it just says there has been skill bias technological change. The other thing is that we need to think outside the Heckscher-Ohlin model. We need to think in broader terms. So the Heckscher-Ohlin model is really about the long run equilibrium. So what we mean by that is that there's no effect on employment, right? We reallocate our resources across different sectors, but we're looking at what's happened at the end of all that reallocation. But the reality is that reallocation takes time. And in terms of the labor market, that means that in order to reallocate workers from one sector to the other, they often have to go through unemployment. And unemployed workers, that's not a good situation. And so if trade is contributing to increased unemployment or reduced employment, that could be another reason that it's affecting the distribution of income in the short run or the medium run that the model is not capturing. So for evidence of this, there's a very famous paper that came out in 2013 by Autor, Dorn, and Hansen. So they're looking at the effects of import competition with Chinese manufactured goods on local labor markets. So the background here is that in 2001, China was granted membership to the WTO, which meant that tariffs that the United States could place on Chinese imports were restricted. So they were capped. And actually before that, so the striking change about this wasn't that tariffs on Chinese imports went down. It's that they were guaranteed to stay low in the future. So really what happened was this big change in uncertainty. So prior to China joining the WTO, Congress actually had to every year approve lower tariff rates on China. And it was never really guaranteed that that was going to happen. And so investing in supply chains or relationships with suppliers in China always had this risk to it. And so when they joined the WTO, that risk went away. And since then, we've seen very large and rapid increases in Chinese imports, particularly in the manufacturing sector. And so what this paper does is they compare local areas with greater employment in the most affected manufacturing sectors to areas that were more insulated from this change just because of their pre-existing industrial mix, what they were producing. So what they find is that import competition is associated with higher employment, lower labor force participation, and lower wages in these local areas that ended up competing more with Chinese imports. And overall, they can find that import competition can explain up to 25% of the decline in manufacturing employment since 2001, or I think maybe since 1995 or something like that. So this paper suggests that in the short run, and especially in local areas that are particularly affected, increased trade can have these pretty profound and persistent effects through worker displacement. So the plant in town closes, people lose jobs, and there might not be, even though exports are rising in one sector and we're reallocating our overall production toward that other sector, that sector just might not exist in that one town. And so these workers can be really out of luck because they're not really benefiting from that increased demand elsewhere. So this has some big policy implications. One of the big effects of trade can be worker displacement. And the United States does have a program called Trade Adjustment Assistance for Dislocated Workers that's supposed to target workers that are affected by increased trade. But it's a very small program, and it's very narrowly targeted. It's not really very accessible. So even for workers that are affected by trade, the requirements for it are a bit strict. But another real issue with the program is that it only affects workers that are displaced by trade and not workers that are affected by displacement or layoffs more broadly. And the thing about the United States labor market is that displacement of workers is a very common phenomenon. So to give you an idea of this, so every month the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out a report, and it's just about total employment in the United States. And typically there's about 180,000 new jobs per month. However, we have some broader statistics about the reallocation of employment in every month. What we see is that about 5 to 6 million jobs are created and destroyed every month. So this 180,000, that's the net change, right? 6 million people gain jobs, 6 million people lose jobs, and the difference between those, there's about 180,000 more gains than losses. But the total gains and losses just totally swamp the net changes, right? And net changes, these aren't all foreclosures. A big chunk of them are involuntary. There's people get fired, there's layoffs, but a lot of them are quits. People are always switching jobs. But the upshot of this is that displacement of workers is a very common phenomenon, and the trade component of this it's actually really quite minimal. And another implication of this skill bias technological change story is that it's not just trade that can have these persistent effects on local employment or unemployment. There are other broader trends. Technological change has probably played as much of a role in the decline of manufacturing towns and other things as trade. And so there are always going to be various sources of these persistent negative shocks, and increased trade is not the only thing. And so it doesn't really make sense to have this program that just goes to trade, workers that are affected by trade and sort of narrowly targeted. It makes more sense to have a suite of policy that helps workers deal with displacement and recover from it, because it is a feature of the economy. And again, this Autor Dorn Hansen paper, they found that import competition could explain up to 25% of the decline in manufacturing employment. So there is another 75% that's going on there. And so it's important to have policies that can deal with displacement or these long-term trends more broadly. So switching gears a little bit, and back to the Heckscher-Ohlin model. The other side of the coin of these changes in factor prices was that we had factor price equalization. And so, the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, that was really about the gains or losses to trade domestically to different factors. But we also had reallocation of income between factors globally. And factor price equalization says that, before trade, we'll have a high wage country and a low wage country, and a high rent country and a low rent country. But after trade, factor prices will equalize. So wages around the world will be the same. And so this implies that trade should actually reduce global inequality between workers or between capital owners, things like that. And in fact, the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, one of the caveats of it is that the relative change in factor prices induced by trade should actually be larger than the relative change in output prices. So factor price equalization should actually be more dramatic than output price equalization. And so the question is, how true is this in practice? So let's take a brief look at global inequality and how it's changed. So these two charts, these are from Our World in Data, which is a great website about all sorts of topics, but especially global inequality. So This is looking at the global distribution of income in 1988 and in 2011. And we can see that in 1988, down here at the low end of income. So by the way, this is less than $500 a year. So this is like very low. And there's this huge amount of the world that's below that bar. And it's especially in China and India, the rest of Asia. And then we have developed countries out here. And there's another local peak here. But if we compare that today, we can see that there's a lot of income growth overall, but especially in the middle. And so we still have this peak down here around $500 a year, but in a relative sense, in the high income and middle income range, we've had a lot of growth. So global inequality is still very high, but it has been falling. And the source of the fall is a lot of growing incomes in China, in India, throughout the rest of Asia, throughout Latin America, and somewhat less in sub-Saharan Africa. So sub-Saharan Africa, we've had a lot of population growth, and there's been some gains from like extremely low income to very low income, and a little bit of middle income. So a lot of global inequality left, but some improvements over the past 30 years or so. And trade has played an important role in this. So trade and export-led development especially has been a really major source of income growth for a few countries. So there's been big success stories. China is one of them. But the Heckscher-Ohlin story of factor price equalization doesn't really do a good job of explaining that. So in practice, the effect of trade on the prices of goods and services. So, the law of one price, that's tended to hold pretty well. But factor price equalization, not so much. Remember, there are these big, huge gaps in the prices of labor, labor earnings worldwide. So factor price equalization hasn't really come to pass. And, equalization is just too strong an assumption. So, like most things, it's just more complex than the model is going to say. The sources of income differences between countries are, very complicated. There's an entire field of economics that studies this. It's called development economics, and trade really only plays a small role. And lastly, I want to talk about the role of immigration in inequality. So this is a bit of a departure from trade, but remember that in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, we saw that trade was like a way of sharing resources, right? It's kind of what factor price equalization was telling us. But another way of actually sharing resources is immigration. So rather than trading goods and services to share labor, we could actually let labor move to different countries, which remember is not allowed in the model, but it does happen in the real world. And that's going to have similar effects on production and factor prices. So the theoretical effects of trade and immigration are pretty similar. There's gains from immigration, there's efficiency and aggregate gains, but it can affect the distribution of income to produce winners and losers. So for example, if you have a labor abundant country and a labor scarce country and you allow immigration, the labor abundant country is going to be a low wage country. And so you're going to have workers moving from one country to the other. And, in theory, it would go until it equalizes. And so wages would be going down here because labor is getting more abundant. You would have factor price equalization. So overall, it's pretty similar. But in fact, for trade, immigration is very heavily restricted. We haven't really had the same increase in immigration flows as we have for trade. And some economists do predict the effects of increased immigration in terms of efficiency and aggregate gains could be massive, absolutely massive. So, economists, well, I guess economists don't really have this joke, but there's this joke about economists about how, they're walking down the sidewalk and someone sees a $5 bill and they say, oh, $5 bill. And then the other person is an economist and they say, well, that can't possibly be true because someone would have already picked it up, right? Because we're always assuming that people are doing the most efficient, beneficial thing already. But rather than like $5 bills on the sidewalk, the effect of increased immigration and the gains that we're missing out on would be like $1 trillion bills on the could be huge. And so just to give you a flavor of that, I've given you a link to this interview with Michael Clemens. He works at a DC think tank. He's one of the guys that's done some of the research estimating the gains to increased immigration. And he's actually done a lot of work estimating the effects of immigration on domestic workers. So what happens when more immigrants come to the US? Do wages go up? They go down? Does nothing happen? It's kind of actually more on the nothing happens part of it for various reasons. But he's done some of these estimates of the effect of increased immigration on total global output, and he's one of the guys saying that it would be absolutely massive. And so, I give you this link to him talking about his research, and you can listen to that and decide whether or not you believe him or not. Okay, so that's it for today. I'm hoping that some of this will be a little helpful for the writing assignments because we've taken more of a look at the world and how to apply these theories to the data. But in any case, I will see you all on Thursday and in the next lecture. Thanks.